Everyone knows Tony Soprano is a disaster in human form. Cheating, lying, violence, pick a category, he wins. So the easy story is, Carmela is the long-suffering wife, stuck in a life she never asked for. Here's the problem with that comforting little narrative. It collapses the second the money shows up. Because Carmela didn't marry a hardworking suburban provider who changed. She married the package. The house, the cars, the gifts, the status, the private school shine, all paid for by the same thing everyone pretends not to see. And the most revealing part is this. She isn't horrified by what Tony does. She's horrified when it becomes impossible to ignore, or when it risks embarrassing her. So if the question is, was Carmela in on it? The answer isn't a courtroom confession. It's quieter than that. It's the way religion becomes a curtain instead of a compass. It's the way morality turns into a negotiation. And it's the moment her so-called independence gets a price tag. In the next few minutes, watch how Carmela doesn't just survive Tony's world. She manages it, benefits from it, and only revolts when the fantasy stops paying. Sympathy for Carmela Soprano tends to evaporate on repeat viewing. And not because Tony suddenly becomes a misunderstood romantic hero. Tony remains exactly what he has always been. Adulterous, violent, emotionally stunted, and professionally devoted to a business model built on coercion and blood. The shift happens because Carmela's performance of innocence becomes harder to tolerate once the audience stops mistaking denial for virtue. The first pass often frames her as the put-upon spouse trapped in a gilded cage. The second pass makes it clear she helped commission the cage, selected the gold plating, and keeps a straight face while calling it family values. This is the central irritation of Carmela Soprano. Not her anger, not her jealousy, not even her occasional cruelty, but the way she packages complicity as martyrdom. The criminal lifestyle is not a surprise that arrived one gloomy morning like an unexpected weather report. It is the foundation of the household. The cars, the house, the jewelry, the private school polish, all of it rests on the same invisible structure: fear, favors, and the unspoken understanding that some strangers will pay so this family can pretend its hands are clean. Carmela knows, and the series is painstaking about showing that she knows. She can't claim ignorance when her own conversations with priests and therapists keep circling the same confession. Comfort has a cost, and she is willing to pay it as long as the invoice arrives in someone else's name. Religion, in her hands, becomes less a moral compass than a decorative screen, something tasteful to hang in front of the parts of life she would rather not examine. There is plenty of genuine belief in Carmela, and that is precisely what makes her hypocrisy so grating. The faith is real enough to soothe her, not real enough to restrain her. The rituals work like a laundering service. Say the words, light the candle, donate to the right cause, and the conscience comes back pressed and folded. In a show populated by professional liars, Carmela's specialty is the lie that sounds like prayer. Materialism is not merely one of her flaws. It is her primary organizing principle dressed up as domestic responsibility. The series does not portray her as someone who likes nice things. It portrays her as someone for whom nice things are the proof that her choices were correct. When moral progress finally appears, when separation, indignation, and self-respect start to form something like a spine, it is not a triumph that gets tested by time. It is a negotiation that gets settled, memorably, by money. The reconciliation is not sealed by remorse, accountability, or any meaningful transformation. It is sealed by a price tag. $500,000 becomes the emotional exchange rate for dignity, and the result is not complicated. A gross compromise, executed like a real estate closing, framed as forgiveness. The most damning element is not that she returns, but why. The return reads less like reconciliation than capitulation to the lifestyle she claims to resent. Tony's sins do not end. The deal simply becomes clearer. Carmela can live with the crimes, live with the cheating, live with the humiliation, provided the terms are profitable and the embarrassment is managed. The arrangement is not do not do it. The arrangement is do not make it impossible to pretend it is not happening. This is why Tony's worst offense, in her eyes, is so often not the act itself, but the exposure, the public disgrace, the phone call that forces the fantasy to drop. Murder is distant, humiliation is intimate. And that is what makes the character so effective. The writing refuses to offer the easy comfort of a victim narrative, while the performance is so precise, it keeps pulling the audience back into empathy, even when the logic says, absolutely not. Edie Falco's portrayal is the quiet miracle here. The acting is not flashy, it is surgical. The power is in the micro-expressions, the way Carmela can glow with affection and adolescent hopefulness in a split second, as if the life she chose still contains the possibility of a clean romance, and then harden into contempt just as quickly when reality reasserts itself. A small moment by a dresser, a corny line from Tony as he moves back in, and her face briefly becomes a catalog of longing, love, attraction, timidity, and the almost embarrassing vulnerability of someone who has practiced disappointment so long it begins to look like maturity. Falco makes that contradiction believable in a 40-something woman because she understands that emotional adolescence is not a matter of age. It is a matter of what a person has refused to confront. Then there is the volcanic confrontation after the infamous phone call, when Carmela learns, in a way she cannot ignore, that Tony has crossed yet another line. It is not merely anger. It is the sound of someone discovering that denial has limits. Falco plays it with such ferocity and specificity that it stops being a fight scene and becomes a moral exposure. The audience does not watch two spouses argue. It watches a worldview collapse in real time. No matter how tiresome Carmela's hypocrisy becomes, moments like that remind viewers why the character matters. She is the domestic face of organized crime, the person who turns brutality into normalcy by insisting on good manners, nice upholstery, and respectable appearances. Yet for all her emotional intensity, Carmela often struggles with the very thing she wants to be admired for, reaching her own children on a human level. She performs motherhood, schedules, meals, expectations, optics, better than she practices emotional attunement. Tony, bizarrely, sometimes shows more empathy, or at least more instinctive emotional reasoning with the kids, even while trapped in his own psychological vault. He is not a better parent in any sustained moral sense, but he can occasionally meet them where they are, instead of where she wants them to be. Carmela's approach too often feels transactional. Behave, achieve, represent the family properly, and then affection will be dispensed. Tony, for all his wreckage, sometimes recognizes despair when it sits in front of him, which is a low bar, and still one Carmela occasionally limbos under. The series, of course, is not a morality play in which one character is pure and the other corrupt. Hypocrisy is the show's native language. Nearly everyone speaks it fluently, which makes any attempt to single out Carmela as uniquely flawed both true and incomplete. Her hypocrisy stands out because it is domestic, respectable, and sanctified by church-going. Other characters own their appetites. Carmela markets hers as duty. In that sense, she is not an outlier. She is a concentrated form of the show's thesis. People will do almost anything to avoid looking honestly at what they are. Consider the therapist, who often gets treated as a rare moral anchor. She is, by comparison, more straightforward than most of the orbiting predators and enablers. She refuses extra money when it is offered. She maintains certain professional boundaries. She withholds information about her own trauma rather than weaponizing it. And eventually, she ends the therapeutic relationship when she recognizes that the sessions are not reforming Tony so much as refining him. That eventually is the point. Her flaw is not that she is corrupt in the same way the mob is corrupt. Her flaw is that she participates for far too long in the dynamic that benefits her ego and her curiosity. She knows early on that therapy can function as an upgrade kit for a charismatic sociopath, giving him language, insight, and tools that make him more effective at being terrible. Yet she keeps playing the role, in part because the role is intoxicating. The famous criminal in the office, the dangerous intimacy of being his confessor, the private thrill of proximity to power without the blood on her hands. Her hypocrisy is intellectual, not material, and it still counts. If Carmela is the domestic manager of denial, Meadow is the child who grows up bilingual in denial and realism. She becomes adept at navigating drama not because she is naturally serene, but because her environment makes emotional evasiveness a survival skill. She has to metabolize the fact that her father is a criminal while he remains, inconveniently, her father. She has to endure the social consequences, the jokes, the whispers, the coded insults, and then return home to a dinner table that insists everything is normal. The show gives her a particularly cruel set of milestones. Bringing a boyfriend home only to watch her father treat him with casual bigotry, dating someone who is drawn to the orbit of mob glamour, and then meeting the consequences, realizing the official explanations are flimsy, understanding, even without being told, that violence is the family's problem-solving method. She is smart enough to suspect the truth, and smart enough to keep quiet about it, which is less a virtue than a sign of the environment's toxicity. Her maturity shows not in grand speeches, but in strategic silence. She does not expose her mother's feelings for Furio, and she does not force her father to confront it. That choice can be read as compassion, as calculation, or as self-preservation. It is difficult to romanticize it as pure moral growth when the likely consequence of disclosure is not divorce papers, but a body. She understands the stakes. She may be protecting her mother, protecting Furio, protecting herself from complicity in what would follow, or all of the above. Silence becomes the only moral act available inside a family where truth tends to get people hurt. That same talent for silence appears again in how she navigates other family scandals. She often recognizes what is being demanded of her. Not honesty, not integrity, but loyalty expressed through selective blindness. She learns when to speak and when not to, and the tragedy is that this skill reads, from the outside, like poise. Inside the story, it is conditioning. She even articulates, at points, an awareness of Tony's long-term infidelity, an acknowledgement that the family has always been built around a bargain of tolerated betrayal. The question is never whether betrayal exists. The question is whether it has disrupted the fantasy. The family's internal accounting is revealed in small, ugly details. Money disappears. Cash moves. Moral outrage turns on and off depending on who benefits. Even the petty question of whether Meadow knows about a stash taken from a household hiding place becomes a miniature commentary on how children in such homes become fluent in financial deception. In this environment, the kids do not merely witness hypocrisy, they inherit it as a practical tool. And then there is AJ, dragged along in adult dramas without comprehending what he is seeing, a walking demonstration of how willful ignorance can be cultivated as a lifestyle. The narrative uses his obliviousness not just for irritation or dark humor, but for characterization. Some children respond to corruption by becoming sharp and strategic. Others respond by becoming numb. AJ is too often numb, and the family treats that numbness as harmless until it is not. This brings the discussion back to Furio, because Furio's arc functions as a mirror held up to both Carmela and Tony, and, more broadly, to the fantasy of old-world ideals that the series delights in interrogating. Furio arrives as a corrective to the Jersey crew's sloppy decadence. Competent, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. He is the enforcer who looks like what the others pretend they are. Early scenes establish him as a man of action with an unbreakable code. The kind of soldier who will shield his superior with his body when danger appears. He is contrasted, explicitly, with the Jersey version of mob masculinity. Lazy brutality, impulsive posturing, performative loyalty. The implication is clear. If the Jersey crew is the imitation, Furio is the imported original. And then the show does something more interesting than turning him into a weekly, kneecap-breaking accessory. It gives him interiority. It makes him lonely. It makes him sensitive to beauty and disgusted by ugliness. It shows him cooking with care and eating alone, savoring craftsmanship while the boss microwaves a meal like a man punishing himself for requiring food. It lets him register the ugliness of American excess, the litter, the cheapness, the way success looks like waste. In other words, it refuses to reduce him to a weapon. The audience may want more scenes of him doing damage, but the series is not primarily interested in action spectacle. It is interested in what violence does to the people who organize their identities around it. Furio's departure is therefore a rare narrative move in this universe. Refusal. He does not betray Tony. He does not seduce Carmela. He does not perform the melodrama of confession. He leaves. The question is whether that leaving is a subversion of the show's masculine code, an act of moral agency, or simply the only rational option for someone who recognizes that desire, in this system, is a death sentence. From a pragmatic standpoint, the explanation is almost insultingly simple. No competent soldier pursues the boss's wife and expects a peaceful life afterward. The code may be hypocritical and selectively enforced, but it is still a code, and violating it is suicidal. Furio comes close to crossing a point of no return, even fantasizing about eliminating Tony in a way that would look accidental. Once that line exists in the mind, the future collapses. There is no clean resolution, no honorable conversation, no romantic elopement. There is only disappearance. From a sociological standpoint, the departure reads like something larger. Furio is both insider and outsider, integrated into Tony's world as muscle and labor, yet never culturally absorbed. He comes from an Italian criminal structure arguably more rigid and patriarchal, yet he sees the American version as degraded, less disciplined, more childish, more consumerist. He has enough detachment to notice what the others normalize. When the contradiction between loyalty and desire becomes unbearable, he does what almost no one else in the series can do. He exits the system, rather than letting the system destroy him. That is not exactly heroic. He does not dismantle anything. He does not free anyone. He does not confront Tony. But in a show where most characters are propelled towards self-destruction by appetite and pride, walking away is practically revolutionary. There is also the meta reading, because the series delights in being self-aware about its genre. Furio's vanishing can be read as commentary on the mafia narrative itself. The romanticized, authentic Italian arrives, briefly lends the story a whiff of old mythology, and then evaporates, as if the writers are acknowledging that the genre's old certainties have stopped working. The show later leans into this kind of commentary through casting choices and explicit nods to earlier mafia cinema, absorbing the old era into its own world and then killing it off. Furio's disappearance fits neatly into that pattern. He does not get a tidy conclusion because the narrative is refusing tidy conclusions as a principle. The discussions around whether Tony would actually look for Furio after Carmela admits her feelings reveal how power really works here, mostly through performance. Tony threatens because threatening is what he does. Threats maintain dominance at home, even if they are meaningless abroad. The idea that Tony could call into Naples and have a high-ranking, well-regarded figure eliminated to soothe his marital pride is a fantasy, and not a flattering one. It would require Tony to explain himself, which would mean admitting weakness, that he could not satisfy his wife, that she desired another man, that his household was cracking. It would also require Italian counterparts to prioritize Tony's wounded ego over their own interests and loyalties, including family ties. The likely reaction would not be obedience, it would be laughter, followed by the calculation of how much business they still want to do with this insecure American. Even within America, the hierarchy is clear. New York looks down on New Jersey, and Italy looks down on American crews as unserious descendants playing dress-up. The notion that Tony's crew has meaningful leverage over Italian power structures is overestimated by anyone seduced by Tony's swagger. What Tony may have done is make a performative call, a gesture, a threat designed purely for Carmela's consumption, weaponizing the idea of violence to punish her emotionally. The story's silence afterward strengthens the impression that it was bluster, the kind of bluster Tony uses as punctuation. The fascination with why Furio would want Carmela, particularly from viewers who reduce romance to conventional attractiveness, misses the point the show is laboring to make. The attraction is not a swimsuit competition. It is symbolic. Carmela represents stability, domestic competence, softness, and a version of the American dream. A home, a family, a social legitimacy that looks clean from a distance. For a lonely man in a foreign environment, she is not merely a woman. She is a life script that seems, briefly, imaginable. She is also forbidden. Desire intensifies when it is prohibited, especially inside hyper-masculine hierarchies where conquest is confused with worth. The boss's wife is the ultimate status object precisely because she cannot be touched without consequence. That does not make the desire noble. It makes it predictable. And Carmela, for her part, responds to Furio not because she is simply looking to cheat, though the pattern of flirtation in her life suggests she is tempted by the idea of escape wherever it appears. She responds because Furio offers the illusion of a better version of the same world. Traditional, attentive, aesthetically alive. He talks about food and culture and community with sincerity, not as a performance of sophistication. He treats her interests as real. He sees her as more than the household manager for Tony's appetites. That alone would be intoxicating to someone starved for recognition. There is even a small symbolic detail offered through gifts, an aged balsamic vinegar from Modena, which carries cultural implications of inheritance, ritual, and dowry. In that reading, the gift is not merely gourmet. It is intimate in a culturally coded way, a gesture that implies a kind of belonging. Whether Furio consciously intends every layer of symbolism is less important than what the gesture communicates within the show's obsession with tradition. He offers her an old-world language of commitment without ever saying the words. Of course, the surrounding culture cannot stop talking about food long enough to process what any of it means. The show practically mocks its own characters and its own audience for drowning serious emotional realities in endless culinary chatter, as if brajola and cheese can substitute for self-knowledge. The appetite for consumption, literal and moral, is everywhere. This leads to the recurring complaint that Furio was wasted as a character, introduced as a formidable enforcer and then underused in outright criminal operations. The criticism has merit if the expectation is a more conventional gangster narrative. Bring in the unstoppable weapon, watch him wreak havoc, enjoy the spectacle. Furio does deliver a few memorable demonstrations of his capability, enough to establish that he is efficient and frightening. The story does not need to repeatedly show him breaking people to prove he can. What it chooses instead is to place him in situations that reveal the show's real interest. Not violence as entertainment, but violence as culture, as identity, and as decay. There is also a misunderstanding embedded in the complaint. Furio's function is not only to be Tony's secret weapon, it is to reflect Tony's failure. Furio embodies discipline and craft, while Tony embodies consumption and entitlement. Furio's presence makes Tony look worse without requiring a single lecture. The contrast between homemade pasta and reheated leftovers is not about food. It is about self-sufficiency versus dependency, tradition versus slovenliness, dignity versus appetite. The old world does not exist as a moral ideal here. It exists as a mirror that shows the American version has become hollow. The abruptness of Furio's exit frustrates viewers who prefer tidy arcs or on-screen climaxes. Yet, the abruptness is thematically consistent with a world where off-screen shifts and messy transitions are part of life. The discomfort with major developments occurring between seasons, or characters reappearing with life-altering changes, speaks to a legitimate storytelling preference, but this show routinely rejects the audience's desire for neatness. It is, almost spitefully, committed to the idea that people vanish, drift, relapse, or reinvent themselves without providing satisfying closure. The Furio Carmela storyline, unpopular to some, also functions as one of the more coherent emotional tragedies in the series. It dramatizes yearning without deliverance. Carmela wants more romance, more recognition, more meaning, yet she has helped build the very structure that prevents her from obtaining it. Her marriage is a golden cage she helped decorate. Furio becomes the embodiment of a life that feels adjacent to hers, but inaccessible. Not merely another man, but another way of being seen. The plot works precisely because it does not culminate in a grand affair. It culminates in loss, which then helps catalyze the marital explosion that follows. He does not just leave her, he leaves her with the knowledge that she was capable of wanting something beyond Tony, and that knowledge becomes unbearable. In defending the storyline, it is important to keep the contradictions intact. Carmela is an idealist who believes in community and Catholicism, even while using both as props. She takes motherhood and homemaking seriously, even while using them as shields against moral responsibility. She stays in the marriage partly for the children and the appearance of stability, and partly because she cannot imagine relinquishing the lifestyle that proves she won. Furio, similarly, is not softened into a romantic hero. He is still the man who can be brutal, the man whose code includes violence. His tenderness does not erase that. It complicates it. He wants connection. He wants someone who sees him as a person rather than a tool. He recognizes in Carmela a parallel kind of entrapment. Both are defined by roles they did not fully choose and cannot easily escape. That is why their conversations do not need to be dazzling. The complaint that they have nothing in common assumes that intimacy is built on witty banter and shared hobbies. In reality, the show frames their connection through mutual recognition. She sees his loneliness. He sees her longing. She offers attention without mockery. He offers a kind of respect she does not receive at home. For two people starved in different ways, that is enough to feel like destiny, or at least relief. None of this absolves Carmela. If anything, it indicts her more sharply. The storyline proves she can perceive decency when it stands in front of her. It proves she can imagine a different moral life. And it proves she chooses, again and again, the life that benefits her materially while harming others abstractly. Her jealousy even surfaces in petty social moments, as if the competition for attention is the only arena where she feels agency. The show is not subtle. The hunger is everywhere, even when it attaches itself to the wrong object. Ultimately, the Carmela problem is not that she is uniquely hypocritical in a hypocritical world. It is that she insists on being regarded as morally serious while treating morality as negotiable. Tony does not ask to be admired for virtue. He asks to be feared and indulged. Carmela asks to be respected for conscience while cashing checks written in intimidation. That is why sympathy drains on rewatch. The first viewing may mistake her for a casualty. The later viewings recognize her as an accountant, balancing sin against comfort, guilt against marble countertops, righteousness against a $500,000 settlement, and calling the result family. The series does not punish her with tragedy the way it punishes some characters. It punishes her with herself, which may be the sharper sentence. And, in the end, that is the show's bleak joke. Everyone wants to be the exception, the one person who can live in the mud and stay clean. Carmela wants to kneel at an altar built from other people's suffering and still hear herself praised for devotion. The tragedy is not that she fails. The tragedy is that she succeeds often enough to keep believing the story. Anyway, $4 a pound. Subscribe for more character autopsies. No romance, no redemption, just truth.